controversial theories, investigated now on BBC Four.
The most celebrated human being in history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary called Jesus. To his followers, he was the Son of God, with miraculous powers to walk on water, heal the sick, and even bring people back from the dead. According to them, he gave his life to save mankind. He was crucified and died. But on the third day, he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But throughout history, people have responded differently to this story. There have been those so inspired by the crucifixion that they wanted to share the experience. But there have also been those who denied the resurrection and have themselves been executed for their beliefs. There have been heresies that suggest that Jesus was rescued from crucifixion and escaped to lead a secret life in southern France. And there have even been people convinced that Jesus survived and traveled to the mountain kingdoms of Kashmir, where he died at the age of 80. To try and solve this 2,000-year-old mystery, some of the most devout Christians and most expert scholars will suggest new ways of reading the Gospels and ask the question, did Jesus die on the cross? Jesus Christ was executed because he was a fundamentalist Jewish agitator in a country only precariously occupied by the Roman Empire. But he inspired a religion that has spread across the whole globe. He did this partly through his teaching and through his life and death. But most of all, he became the inspiration for millions because his followers believed that he had risen from the dead. Christianity is based upon the resurrection of Christ and upon the concept of the gospel truth. To question one is to question the other. Throughout history, the Church has treated these questions as heresy and persecuted those who asked them. But 2,000 years after the events, many modern scholars and theologians, and even some who are training for the priesthood, now seem to doubt the historical accuracy of the Gospels, and even the literal truth of the idea that Jesus rose from the dead.
Recently, I was teaching a graduate class, and 4 of the members of the graduate seminar are studying to be priests and ministers. And I asked them, do you believe this about the resurrection? And one of them, startled, said, well, no, but that's a secret.
The reality is, if you go into any theological college, any seminary, that's been the view for years. I mean, no one would have any problem with that. And again, it comes down to this rather patronising belief that ordinary folk out there have to believe that Noah's Ark existed, and have to believe that Mary was a virgin, and have to believe all this gumph, because somehow they can't be trusted to know that it's a bit more complicated than that.
I've never been able to find a real dichotomy myself between being a good historian and a good theologian, or a good historian and a Christian, to put it very bluntly. I do not believe that gods and goddesses or anyone ever comes down from heaven and produces divine babies. I don't believe it actually happens. Nor do I think that Jesus, in a literal sense, went up to heaven to take his place at the right hand of God.
But how has it happened that so many Christian theologians have managed to interpret the Bible in ways that would once have been seen as heretical? The most obvious reasons can actually be found in the original text themselves, in the 4 Gospels.
I think all the gospel stories or the gospel accounts, they're something that's handed to us from childhood, really. So as we're sitting in our primary schools, we're told that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they were 4 apostles, and Jesus did this and Jesus did that, and we see the pictures. And to a certain extent, we're not encouraged to question beyond that. It's presented as a narrative. It's presented as a storyline that actually happened. And I think for a lot of people, their belief never goes further than that. They simply remember these stories, and that's what happened. And I think the problem is, for individuals, when you start moving beyond that and try to work out what exactly the Gospels are.
Almost all we currently think we know about Jesus comes from the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Even if they were the authors, Matthew and John were the only evangelists who were members of the 12 disciples, and therefore could have been witnesses to the events. Luke was a physician and a companion of St. Paul, and Mark was an interpreter who probably worked with St. Peter in Rome, and some say he may even have been St. Peter's son. These four Gospels were all apparently written between 40 and 100 years after the crucifixion. And the fact is that although we know them by those four names, modern biblical scholars cannot be absolutely sure who really wrote them.
Originally, all these Gospels circulated anonymously. There were no names attached to them until almost 200. And the Christian theologian who came up with the idea of having a New Testament was roundly condemned as a heretic.
I mean, I grew up Catholic, and we were always told not to read the Bible. It was dangerous. The priest would tell us what the Bible said.
So we begin our Mass by thinking of the times when we've been unfaithful to the Lord, and we ask for his forgiveness.
The reason that the priest would tell us what the Bible said is that the original texts are full of inconsistencies.
Jesus said to them, "How many loaves have you?" 7, they said, "and a few small fish."
For example, did Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few small fish? Or did he, as is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, do both of those things?
They all ate as much as they wanted. And they
So historically, how reliable can the Gospels be? One story on which they are all clear, concise, and more or less agree is the story of the crucifixion.
This is the Gospel of the Lord.
Every year at Easter, Christians in the Philippines reenact the crucifixion of Jesus as described in the Gospels. They actually volunteer to be crucified. They do it because they believe it will help them to purge their sins. For the onlookers, it's a bloody and brutal reminder of what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
Crucifixion was the most cruel and atrocious punishment that the Romans could inflict. And it was inflicted only for treason and only on slaves. If you were a nobleman and you were a traitor, then normally you were strangled, something much simpler and much easier and much less painful. After condemnation, the cross beam, was strapped to the shoulders of the criminal, and he paraded through the streets with his arms stretched out. At the place of execution, then, nails were hammered into the hands and the feet.
In the Philippines, they use real nails. They do experience the real pain that Jesus felt. In fact, a man nailed to the cross does not die from his wounds. He dies, surprisingly, from suffocation. Hanging just by your arms from a cross, your chest is compressed. It's hard to breathe without supporting your body weight on your legs. Over time, the strain on the legs and the pain make that impossible, and you are unable to breathe. In the Philippines, the volunteers are brought down from their crosses within an hour. Death from crucifixion takes much longer, often several days. The only way to hasten death on the cross was to break the legs, making it immediately impossible to support your weight, and therefore to breathe. But the Gospels are all agreed that Jesus died after only 3 to 6 hours. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour.
And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Some think that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion.
It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost.
Matthew and Mark clearly have Jesus surviving a little longer.
And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out.
The disciples wanted to take Jesus' body down from the cross immediately, but the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was doubtful.
And Pilate marveled if he were already dead.
Pilate was reassured by the centurion that Jesus was dead. But this was the same centurion who had earlier said,
Truly, this man was the Son of God.
Jesus' body was then laid in a tomb donated by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. This Joseph and a man called Nicodemus came to minister to the body.
They came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight.
These accounts, when viewed as an historical rather than a sacred record, may raise many questions. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Why did Joseph and Nicodemus take so many herbs into the tomb? But no one really doubts that Jesus was crucified. Even in Jerusalem, where the crucifixion happened, and where one is forced to remember that we do not live on a Christian planet, one is also reminded that Christians, Jews and Muslims all accept that Jesus was a man who lived and died in 1st century Palestine. What really separates the Christians from everyone else is their belief in the gospel story that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built upon what was supposed to be the tomb in which Jesus was laid after the crucifixion. This, according to devout Christians, is the exact site of the resurrection. And if anything can be described as the cornerstone of the Christian faith, it is the resurrection of Jesus.
If you take away the resurrection, what you're saying is that Jesus was a Messiah who said some really interesting things, and some things that we might all want to copy, and then he died. And so, therefore, he has no greater significance than that.
I think any ancient historian has to look very hard at the question, why did Christianity begin and why did it take the shape it did? And when you're trying to look at why that happened, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence say, well, it happened because of who Jesus was, but particularly because he was raised from the dead.
The resurrection of Jesus, as far as all the Christian churches are concerned, is absolutely fundamental to the faith. There's no question, in my mind, that it's ever going to be changed.
But while the resurrection may be fundamental to the faith, the gospel accounts of it, unlike those of the crucifixion, are full of inconsistencies and curious contradictions.
When we read the resurrection narratives, it's like reading 4 different reports of the same football game in 4 rather different newspapers. And the fact that actually there may be some disagreement about whether it was a foul or not doesn't mean that there wasn't a game and that somebody didn't win it and so on. If one of them says there were 2 angels and another one says there was 1 angel, if one of them says Mary Magdalene was there all by herself and somebody else says Mary Magdalene was there with 1 or 2 other women, then these are the sorts of variations that you expect to get, like the different newspaper reports of the football match. And they're not something that should worry you to the point of saying, therefore nothing happened. That would be quite a false conclusion.
But the Gospels do not just disagree about the number of angels or how many women arrived at the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection, the Gospels literally lose the plot. In the earliest versions of the earliest Gospel, Mark, there are no resurrection appearances at all. The Gospel simply ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. The last verses of Mark, which do contain resurrection stories, were added 200 years later. Matthew and Luke do have resurrection appearances, but they don't agree about the details. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women near the tomb and then meets his disciples just one time, and that is on a mountain in Galilee. In Luke, Jesus meets 2 unnamed disciples who do not recognize him, and then meet with the remaining disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem. The last Gospel, John, has many different stories that do not appear in any of the other Gospels. Having all these differing Gospel versions of the story is confusing.
None of the Gospel stories is CNN in Jerusalem in the year 30.
These aren't people who are standing at the foot of the crucifix with notebooks in their hand, writing it all down.
The Gospels are written in the form of historical biography, so many people have assumed that they are exactly that. But that's not actually what they are. They're written to demonstrate to people the importance and the meaning of Jesus and his teaching. That was what they're for, and they do that very well. But they're not primarily interested in what actually happened back there.
So one is forced into the apparently blasphemous position of doubting the historical truth of the Gospels.
If you start saying it's blasphemous to question gospel truth, which particular bits of the gospel are you choosing to say that about? Or are you saying all of them? And if you say it's all of them, there are endless bits that contradict each other. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John tell different accounts. I mean, some of them don't even tell about Christ being born in a stable. You know, which bits are true and which bits aren't true? If you look at the Easter narrative, the key narrative of the different Gospels, they all tell different accounts. Some of them don't mention the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, what is gospel truth? There are 4 Gospels. They all tell different truths. Surely people have to realise that it's much more complicated than that.
These complications have led many modern scholars to suggest that the Gospel stories were not written to tell of a miraculous event, but that they were written with an entirely different and political motive.
Whether we like it or not, the function of the stories in the last chapters of the Gospel is not to establish Jesus has risen. Isn't that marvelous? Which surely would be enough to say. But Jesus has risen, of course. But to whom did Jesus speak? And whom did Jesus put in charge?
Insisting that Jesus literally rose from the grave and was seen by a few people who knew him after he died is a way of restricting the experience of resurrection to a very few people, and therefore maintaining the authority of the group within that group.
You have competing leadership accounts using apparitions or empty tombs to establish who's in charge here or who's in charge there. That's their function, that's their purpose.
So Peter is said to be the first witness of the resurrection. To this day, of course, for example, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the descendant of St. Peter, and authorized, by an unbroken chain of ordination from Peter. That is, the resurrection is taken to be validation, in many cases, of the authority of the churches.
Some scholars go so far as to suggest that the story of the resurrection was created not only to give authority to the church, but also as an extraordinary psychological tool to bring in new converts.
If it hadn't been for the resurrection of Jesus and his rising from the dead, victorious from the dead, we wouldn't be celebrating Christmas.
It's a bit like when you go into the army. The first thing we want is to take over your body. So symbolically, let's say we're going to shave all your hair. As long as you give in on this, we got you. We got your body, which is what we want. In one sense, sometimes the churches, some churches at least, do the same. We're going to tell you something unbelievable that you got to believe. If you believe it, then you will believe that they alone control heaven, that without them you cannot get into heaven, and then they've got you. You've left your brains in the parking lot.
That's a statement that may be offensive to many Christians. It would certainly be offensive to the worshippers at the Toronto Airport Church, who take their belief in the literal truth of the resurrection of Jesus very seriously indeed.
Well, I hear this singing in the streets, now Jesus is alive. All creation shouts aloud that Jesus is alive.
For these Christians, the risen Christ is an active part of the church, and they believe that in 1994, Jesus blessed their church with a miraculous healing mission.
In the spirit for 1 minute.
Since then, thousands of churches around the world have claimed to be touched by what has become known as the Toronto Blessing.
1 minute. Bless you, man. Oh, blessed
Okay, blessing means everything that God has to give.
The fastest growing and most active parts of the Christian church in the 21st century seem to be those which, despite all the contradictions and anomalies, fervently promote the literal truth of the gospel stories of Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection.
Blessed!
And in Toronto, in a splendid new church built by contributions from the faithful, the congregation continued to celebrate their belief in the resurrected Christ.
Well, be blessed.
Here, on an almost weekly basis, they claim that their faith has the power, miraculously, to heal.
So God's going to heal you right now? There it goes, and the neck is healed in Jesus' name. Don't you like it? I like it. Bless you, brother.
Today, it seems to me that there are many people who will strongly defend the literal truth of the resurrection. Many others believe that perhaps, those who die may be alive in some way, that Jesus who died might be in some sense alive, whatever one means by that. And there are many others who take it as an image of hope, because after all, talking about the resurrection of Jesus has a great deal to do with what we think about life after death, or for that matter, our own prospects.
But the problem for the church in the 21st century, in a technological and secular age, is that people find it harder and harder to believe in the literal truth of any of the miracles, let alone the miracle of the resurrection.
Since the 18th century, we've lived in a climate where people have distinguished between faith and belief. So the whole effect of science on religion really has been to throw religion back, to prove what we can believe in.
But week in and week out, congregations gather in Christian churches and recite together an ancient creed. From the Latin word credo, meaning I believe.
We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty.
We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty.
For our sake.
At the climax of the creed, all Christians affirm their belief in the resurrection.
He suffered death and was buried. On the third day he rose again.
In accordance with the Scriptures.
He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father.
He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead.
But whatever is said in church, many modern Christian theologians no longer consider the resurrection to be an historical fact. And it's not just a 21st century problem that there are differences between what the church wants us to believe and what people actually do believe.
We look for the resurrection of the dead.
1,000 years ago, a group of devout Christians also held unorthodox views.
There have certainly down the ages been people within the bosom of Christianity who have had problems with the whole idea of resurrection and Christ's death and resurrection. If you look at the Cathars believed that the world was the creation of the devil, that it was irredeemably evil, everything about it was bad. So therefore they had great difficulty with believing the idea that Jesus would come here as a man anyway. Why would he want to come to this terrible place? But what they certainly had a problem with, why on earth would he be resurrected? Why would he want to come back to this earth? The church was so appalled by what it saw as this terrible blasphemy about the resurrection that they created the Inquisition. Off it went to the Cathars to the south of France, and it gouged out their eyes, it stretched them on racks, it burnt villages, it cut limbs off, and simply because it couldn't bear to hear people questioning these unquestionable truths as far as it was concerned.
In 1244, the last 200 of the Cathars were rounded up and burned at the stake as heretics. The Inquisition went on to spend 300 years suppressing anyone who questioned either the concept of gospel truth or the historical accuracy of the resurrection. But there is one story, also set in France at about the same time as the Cathars, which tells of another Christian group who made a discovery which really did suggest that the resurrection story was not true. And what they did was to hide the evidence. In the 13th century, this whole area was a stronghold of the Knights Templar, a strict military and religious order of warrior monks. Local historian Thierry Lecomte has spent the last 12 years uncovering the history of the Knights Templar in this region.
Les Templiers, ils seraient venus dans la région parce qu'il y a des traces notamment campagne, et en revenant par ici, du côté de Serres, on a des traces. En bas derrière, en bas du château de Blanchefort, il y a des ruines de Favy, qui serait une ancienne commanderie templière.
The Knights Templar were committed to poverty, chastity, and the protection of pilgrims en route to the Holy Land. But their main purpose was to keep Jerusalem and the holy sites of Christianity free from the forces of Islam. While they were in the Holy Land, the Templars built their own castles, but they buried their dead in graves they excavated near to the original Temple of Solomon. And certainly during this time, they were thought to have discovered great treasures. Eventually the Templars were forced to leave the Holy Land in 1186. They returned to France. Certainly the Templars remained powerful, rich, and incredibly secretive. So it's not surprising that people speculated about them, and there grew a legend that the Knights Templar had discovered Jesus' bones in Jerusalem, that they had brought them back to France and buried them somewhere near here. In the last 200 years, the search has focused on a small church in the village of Rennes-le-Château. Modern scholars like Richard Andrews are convinced that there are clues here that might reveal what exactly the Templars did find during their excavations in Jerusalem.
One can ask the question, did the Templars find relics, an ossuary full of bones, that they thought were possibly the bones of Jesus? Now, if they had found these, it would have been a shock to the system, because the Templars were good Christians. This would challenge the whole doctrine of resurrection, because here are mortal remains. So we ask the second question, why should the Templars risk being accused of heresy and bringing the bones that they thought were Jesus's back to this area? The answer is simple. If they had found something which they believed were the bones of Christ, they needed a safe location. You could hide a church in these mountains, let alone a small ossuary. You can get lost in these mountains today. Imagine what it was like 1,000 years ago.
In the late 19th century, a local priest called Berenger Saunier claimed to have found ancient documents, and whatever they were, he certainly became very rich afterwards. Richard Andrews has found clues among these parchments, using elaborate geometry and transferring symbols from ancient paintings onto equally ancient maps, all in the hope of finding a Templar treasure trove.
The clues that we found point to a map in the form of a hexagram, which is also known as the Seal of Solomon, but it is the Star of David. This map points to a specific site. Now we know that the priest, Berenger Saunier, became fabulously wealthy, but we are sure that he didn't actually find what he was looking for. We can deduce, perhaps, that Saunier received money from patrons to look for a location in the area that might reveal perhaps the bones of Christ. Whatever it is, we do know one thing for sure. The secret that Saunier was giving clues to was heretical.
Saunier died in 1917 and took his secret with him to the grave. But that hasn't stopped enthusiasts like Thierry Lecomte from continuing to search on the basis of Richard's work and trying to solve the mystery. Using a local map on which the geometric lines have been transposed, Thierry has found further evidence of the Templars' existence, and he believes that he may be closing in on the location where the Templars could have buried the bones of Jesus.
Là, vous avez le sommet du Cardou, là, où il y a deux cèdres. Ils sont espacés tous les deux, à peu près, il y a une dizaine de mètres. Il faut un alignement, on suit cet alignement, on traverse la vallée de Rennes-les-Bains, Et là, on arrive au plateau des Bruyères, où il y a un rocher, où il y a une croix, pile dans l'alignement des deux cèdres. J'ai traversé la boussole, j'ai mis beaucoup de temps, puis beaucoup d'échecs avant d'arriver au but, mais j'étais persuadé qu'il y avait effectivement quelque chose, soit un cèdre ou une croix. Donc j'ai trouvé une croix. Voilà cette fameuse croix. Je suis passé longtemps, pendant des années à côté, mais sans trouver le point. Elle s'est située un petit peu en retrait vis-à-vis du plateau. Et j'ai mis à peu près 12 ans pour la trouver, cette fameuse croix.
Even if the Knights Templar did bring Jesus' bones in an ossuary back here from the Holy Land, it's unlikely that Richard Andrews or Thierry Lecomte would ever find them in these mountains. But there have been those who have gone back to the original and differing gospel texts and have found clues to a more credible, but no less startling or heretical explanation of what might have happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen. And those two possibilities are even talked about in the New Testament.
According to Matthew, the Jews who were hostile to Jesus' followers claimed that his disciples had stolen his body out of the grave and then pretended he was resurrected.
While the enemies of Christians immediately came up with conspiracy theories to explain the resurrection, the stories told by the Gospels are very down-to-earth. They describe how Jesus was alive again. He ate, he drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that people who have always looked for natural explanations of miracles have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge.
They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth.
And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance.
When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished."
But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the 3rd survived.
So is it possible that Jesus could somehow have survived? Certainly he was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers check the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts. And they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb. And presumably it's sealed up and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs. So could it be that Jesus was resuscitated in the tomb?
A lot of modern people, I think, confuse the term resurrection with life after death. Resurrection is a Hebrew idea, and it's the notion that someone is in the world of the dead, which the Hebrews call Sheol, and they have their body's been buried, and they resuscitate, or they come back. A term we might use today would be resuscitation more than resurrection. It would actually get the idea. We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
Whatever actually happened, the different gospel stories do all agree that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. But if Jesus survived, it doesn't necessarily mean that the resurrection was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood. At the end of the 19th century, the English writer Samuel Butler, in his book on the resurrection, came up with the theory that if Jesus had collapsed in a shock-induced coma on the cross and then recovered, he and the disciples would actually have believed his recovery was a miraculous resurrection.
That still has great credibility if you see it in the light, for instance, of more contemporary developments. Look at the near-death experience in the United States. Something like 13 million people in the United States say they've had near-death experiences. They've seen this white light. They believe it to be some form of miracle. So the idea that in the first century, when they had none of this scientific insight and they had none of these hospitals or whatever to save them, that people thought it, actually makes a lot of sense. Doesn't make them fraudsters or shysters. It actually makes them genuine people who thought they'd witnessed a miracle.
Whatever the circumstances, if Jesus was alive, then he and his disciples face a serious problem.
If Jesus was placed in the tomb and somehow was revived, he himself would certainly think that was an act of the grace of God. I came right to the bars of death and was brought back. But now there's a practical problem. It's a political problem, actually. Romans basically do one thing to messiahs. They crucify them.
It is clear that either through resurrection or resuscitation, Jesus did survive the crucifixion. But he faces a problem. He's a condemned man. The Bible is said to solve this problem with a miracle called the Ascension. Jesus is taken bodily into heaven. But the original texts are even more confused when it comes to the Ascension than they were about the resurrection. The Ascension does not actually appear in the original form of any of the Gospels. The Ascension references in Mark are among the verses which, as we have seen, were added 200 years after the events. There is one line in Luke which reads, "and was carried up into heaven." But again, this doesn't appear in all Bibles. It was in fact inserted simply because the Ascension is referred to in a later book of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, and it's always been assumed that Luke was the author of Acts. There's no Ascension in Matthew, and John's Gospel ends with the enigmatic words,
"And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written."
So what were the many other things that Jesus did? One of the stories that emerges from this question depends upon another heretical idea, that Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene was a very special one, perhaps even a sexual one.
If you read John's Gospel, the first person who saw the risen Christ, i.e. the first Christian, was Mary Magdalene. So I think when the church tries to sideline the idea that Jesus had relationships with women, that he had close relationships with women, it's laughable, really. I mean, it's part of this problem that they always say that that the thing that non-believers find hardest about Jesus was his divinity, and the thing that Christians always find hardest about Jesus was his humanity. I mean, he was a man. I'm perfectly happy with the concept that Jesus had a relationship with Mary Magdalene, that it was long and important and, was one of the dominant things in his life. He was human.
Some historians go even further and suggest that Jesus and Mary might have married. and that they might even have had children. So if we are trying to find out where Jesus could have gone, perhaps we should start by finding out where Mary went. There is a tradition that some years after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene came to the Camargue region of the south of France. Here she lived and died, and the Basilica Sainte-Marie-Madeleine is a shrine to her memory. This was the center of what became known as the Cult of the Magdalene.
The cult of the Magdalene was very powerful in France up until the Middle Ages. The faithful wanted to believe in a mother figure, and the church were very anxious that they should not believe in Mary Magdalene as having been a mother figure for obvious reasons, which were that she might have been the spouse of Christ, that she might have had his child, that she might have produced a bloodline.
The local legends describe how Mary Magdalene came here with her brother Lazarus and her sister Martha and a few companions. Perhaps then, if the relationship between Jesus and Mary was as close as some sources suggest, one of those companions, traveling incognito for fear of arrest by the Romans, was Jesus himself.
Jesus could have taken ship at Caesarea or one of the smaller ports up the Syrian coast, and he could have left for another life. And he could well have arrived, as a lot of people believe, in this part of France and begun a new life. He could even have brought his family with him. So these stories could have a historical foundation.
After her death, Mary Magdalene's relics were placed in a sarcophagus and then hidden. It wasn't until 1279 that they were rediscovered. This basilica was built for their safekeeping, and sealed within the crypt, in the center of the church, is what is claimed to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. The idea that Jesus went to the south of France may seem far-fetched. After all, if any of the stories were true, it's hard to believe that the original writers of the Gospels could have completely eradicated all the evidence. If the faithful knew that Jesus was in fact still alive, surely they would have shared that knowledge, and surely they must have hoped that at some time in the future it would have been safe for Jesus to return, and evidence for that hope should be somewhere in the original text. It is. The disciples were expecting Jesus to return. They were expecting what has become known as the second coming. But this was not necessarily going to be a miraculous return.
Jesus definitely went away. Whatever view of resurrection you take, resuscitation or divine miracle, in the traditional sense of belief in resurrection, he goes away. He says, I'm going away. The disciples say, can we come? He says, no. And he says, I'm going to come again. Now what's interesting about that is normally, if someone says they're going away, and they're going to come back, and you're sort of looking at your watch or your calendar wondering, okay, he said he went away, he's going to come back, you would take it in that everyday sense.
The concept of a heavenly second coming with Jesus returning on the Day of Judgment was only created after it became clear that he had not returned in that everyday sense.
That key Christian idea of the second coming, that Jesus having come once and died and risen from the dead will come again, is very much a distinctive Christian idea. Christianity borrows most of its ideas from Judaism, but this is one that it thought up on its own. If you look at the Messiah tradition in Judaism, and obviously when Jesus was around, the Jews were expecting their own Messiah. They were expecting him to come and sort everything out, and that would be an end to it. They weren't expecting him to come, half sort things out, die, go off somewhere, and then come back a bit later on. This is really, the second coming is one of the distinctive Christian ideas.
But does the concept of a heavenly second coming ignore the very matter-of-fact nature of some of the references to it in the Bible?
A lot of those references to Jesus coming back might in fact be taken more in an everyday sense of someone going away to accomplish certain mission and then planning to return when that mission was accomplished.
But if Jesus did leave Palestine, France still doesn't seem a likely destination. It was, after all, a Roman colony. Some claim that if Jesus did survive the crucifixion, his first priority would be to escape from the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire.
You just look at a map. Palestine is on the far eastern border of the Roman Empire. If you go west, you're going right into the heart of Roman territory, where we have our 15 legions stationed around the world. If you go east, you're crossing over into Parthia, and you're going towards Persia eventually, and India and Afghanistan, that direction.
And if Jesus thought he was the Jewish Messiah, there was another reason why he might have traveled east.
People forget that the Messiah's got to do essentially two things. Everyone remembers he's got to bring world peace and justice and defeat evil. That's all the way through the prophets. When the Messiah comes, he's the Prince of Peace. But the other huge task is he's got to gather all the scattered tribes of Israel back to the land of Israel. Now, this takes a bit of explaining, but it's not too complicated. The people we know today as the Jews are only one tribe, the tribe of Judah. And we have in the Hebrew Bible the story of 10 of the tribes being taken away to the east, to the northeast, by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. They become known in history as the lost tribes because nobody knows exactly what happened to them. We do, though, we can speculate that if Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah, he might have had in mind, I've got to go and present myself to these dispersed brothers and sisters off wherever they might be.
The journey east from Israel in the 1st century was surprisingly easy, by land or by sea, on the Silk Route or the Spice Route. It's an accepted fact, for instance, that the disciple Thomas travelled to India and founded a church there.
The great tradition of the Indian church is that it was founded by Thomas the Apostle. To travel to India would be no problem. He just had to go down to Gaza and link up with one of the spice trains returning, and then from Yemen get a boat to India. It would have been a very simple, easy procedure that was done regularly.
And there's another reason Jesus might have been tempted to travel east. But to understand that, we have to go back to the year of his birth. We all recognize the story in Matthew's Gospel of the 3 wise men who followed a star and presented themselves and their gifts to the baby Jesus. What we perhaps don't recognize immediately is the similarity between this story and the traditions of a religion that is 500 years older than Christianity, Buddhism. When a great Buddhist holy man or lama dies, wise men consult the stars and other omens and set off, often on extraordinarily long journeys, to find the infant who is the reincarnation of the lama. When the child is old enough, he is taken away from his parents and educated in the Buddhist faith. Could this be the origin of the story of the 3 wise men? Could Jesus have been taken to India as a child and taught to be a Buddhist? The Russian writer Nikolai Notovich, traveling in India in the 19th century, discovered an ancient manuscript in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet. In his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, Notovich translated this manuscript, and it tells of a divine child called Isa, born in the 1st century to a poor family in Israel. Isa came to India at the age of 14, where he learned the laws of Buddhism before returning to Israel at the age of 29. This idea would certainly explain the otherwise odd fact that from the age of 14, to 29, there is absolutely no record of Jesus' existence in Palestine. Certainly, the later teachings and miracles of Jesus have uncanny parallels with the teachings and miracles of the Buddha. Loving your enemies and the idea that the meek will inherit the earth have absolutely no tradition or precedent in Judaism, but they are entirely consistent with Buddhism.
He cometh unto them, walking on the sea. He walks upon the water without parting it, as if on solid ground. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Riches make a man greedy, and so are like a caravan, lurching down the road to hell. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Let the wise man do righteousness, a treasure that others cannot share, which no thief can steal, a treasure which doth not pass away.
But if Jesus traveled or returned to the east, surely there would be legends, like those in the south of France, to support the idea. And of course, there are such traditions. In fact, the people here in Kashmir call their tribe Ben-e Israel and claim to be descendants of the lost tribes. And here there are stories that in the 1st century, Isa, known locally as Yusasaf, meaning leader of the healed, returned to Kashmir in his 30s. Yusasaf's ministry here can easily be seen as a continuation of the Jesus ministry. In a local temple called the Temple of Solomon, there used to be an inscription which told of Yusasaf's claim, made about 50 AD, to be Jesus, the prophet from Israel.
तमाम कश्मीर की तारीखों में यही लिखा है कि ये बाहर से आया है, ये प्रॉफिट था, ये पैगंबर था और इस्राइल से आया, नस्बैन से अंदर बॉर्डर में आया है और फिर यही तबलीग कर रहा है। वही जीसस है, वही मसीह भी है, क्योंकि यूज़ असद के माने हैं जो कोड़ी के मर्ज़ में हूँ उनको शिफा देने वाला, उनका इलाज करने वाला जो शिफा याब हुए उसको यूज़ असद के दूसरे माने हैं कि यूज़ असद के दूसरे माने हैं जमा करने वाला।
Yusasaf continued to teach and to preach in Kashmir until he died around the year 80 AD. He was buried in Srinagar. And this rather modest building is, they say, his tomb. The first shrine erected around the site was built in 112 AD. In fact, it is now a shared gravesite. In the 15th century, the Islamic holy man Syed Nazir ud-Din was also buried here. Although both the gravestones under the cloth point north-south in the Islamic tradition, the body of Yusasaf is buried beneath in a grave dug east-west in the Jewish tradition. But this is a sacred site, and short of exhumation, there is no way of discovering whether the body buried here is that of a man who once survived crucifixion. However, next to the sarcophagus are the carved footprints of Yusasaf, and they do have marks or scars on them.
अच्छी उम्र में ये फोत हो गया है और उसके पाँव के निशानात का पत्थर पर उन्होंने कुंदा कर रखे हैं, जैसे कि थे वैसे ही रखे हैं निशान के तौर पर। उनमें जख्मों के निशानात बिल्कुल साफ नजर आते हैं। जो सलीब पर चढ़ाने की वजह से उनके पाँव में जख्म आए थे.
The position of the scars, just behind the toes, do not match each other, but they would align if a single nail was driven through both feet with the left foot placed on top of the right. There are many who believe this to be the tomb of Jesus. If this is the tomb of Jesus, then he spent most of his life in the mountain kingdom of Kashmir. He did not die on the cross. There was no resurrection. He did not ascend into heaven, and he does not sit at the right hand of God. For many Christians, this would be the end of Christianity as we know it. For some, the original story would still have the power to comfort us as we approach death.
For me, the resurrection is about death. The two things that will happen to us all in our life is that we'll be born and that we'll die. They're the two things we know nothing about. And we have this great void before and we have this great void afterwards. So in Jesus' resurrection at the end of the Easter story is the symbolism of our own resurrection, of our own new life. That in many ways is the great strength of Christianity, and I think to kind of get away from it, to get away from that incredibly powerful symbolism of the resurrection that touches each and every one of us because of the reality of what will happen to us, and start debating whether, you know, bones in a tomb matter or whether it actually happened, completely misses the point of Christianity.
But for some theologians, the story of the resurrection is little more than a witness to the grief felt by the disciples at the loss of their leader.
My own working assumption is that Jesus' followers were scattered and discouraged, as they said, and that some of them became convinced that he was actually alive. I don't know how that happened, but certainly it does happen, even today, that many people with a sudden or not sudden loss, bereavement, become convinced that the person that they thought they had lost is somehow alive. And that conviction apparently was very powerful for some of these people, and then it spread.
For others, the resurrection is purely a symbol of the continuing power of Jesus, summed up in the experience of the two disciples who had not recognized the risen Jesus until he broke bread with them.
And their eyes were opened, and they knew him.
The person who wrote that was not trying to describe an apparition. It would be like a preacher on Easter Sunday saying Jesus is among us this morning, and you don't expect people to go looking under the seats for where is he? They understand. It's the presence of Jesus they're describing. In one sense, it's a perversion of resurrection to reduce it to a body coming out of the tomb. Do you not believe? And it's bad history, not just bad theology.
Tomorrow, we follow a group of American missionaries devoting their lives to making a new version of a 25-year-old film about the life of Christ, which they're specifically targeting at a Muslim audience, Selling Jesus at 10. Next tonight, which is the better read, Bridget Jones or Pride and Prejudice? A battle of the books coming up.